Hello, and welcome to the M1 Press webinar, Beyond Impact Factor, an overview of citation metrics. I'm Joanna Gillette, Product Marketing Manager at Allen Press, and I'll be your host today. On your screen, you should see some general information about participating in today's webinar. I'm going to go over a few of these items very quickly before we get started. Our presenter will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. If you do have questions, please use the chat function of WebEx to direct questions to the webinar host, which is me, during the presentation. We are using Voice over IP technology to broadcast the audio for today's webinar, so please be sure you have the volume turned up on your PC if you're having trouble hearing. Voice over IP quality may vary depending on network traffic today. If you are having trouble hearing, please call in to listen to the webinar over our conference line. The toll-free telephone number and participant passcode for the conference line are listed next to the green telephone icon on this slide. If you do call into the conference line, please be sure to mute your telephone. You can continue the conversation with us and your fellow attendees after the webinar using the Discussions tab of the Allen Press Facebook page. Here you can post a comment, share an idea, or ask a question. You can also share your thoughts during and after the webinar via Twitter. Please be sure to use our webinar hashtag APWeb22. Today, Lindsay Gibbons will give us an overview of citation metrics that may be applied to journals, articles, and authors. Lindsay will show us how each metric is calculated and share benefits and limitations of each method. Lindsay Gibbons is a publishing specialist at Allen Press. She earned her MA in Children's Literature at Kansas State University and her BA in Creative Writing at the University of Arkansas. Lindsay is an Air Force brat who enjoys international travel, scuba diving, ballroom dance, and reading. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Lindsay now. Don't forget to send me your questions.
As someone with a background primarily in English, citation metrics were a bit bewildering to me when I first entered the publishing industry. I hadn't even had to think about complex formulas since my undergraduate business courses, and I'm guessing many of you are in the same boat. Today I'm going to talk about some of these formulas and how they are important to the publishing industry. I will be mentioning the pros and cons of the metrics. They do all have strengths and weaknesses, but I will not be evaluating the metrics themselves. I'm not here to tell you which are good or bad. I'm just trying to share a little insight into what they are, what they're trying to accomplish, and how exactly each of them are different. I'm going to start off discussing journal-level metrics, meaning these are intended to give quantifiable scores on the journal level. They are not meant to rate individual authors, so they are sometimes inaccurately used for this. Most of us in the industry are probably most familiar with the impact factor. In order to talk about other metrics, we first have to at least touch on the impact factor so we can discuss similarities and differences. There is a lot more to be said about the impact factor than what I'm going to go into here, so I encourage you to check out some other resources. Allen Press has some great presentations archived on our website, allenpress.com, and journalmetrics.com has also put out some extremely helpful white papers on the topic. Additionally, there's a scholarly kitchen post from just this morning titled Altmetrics, Replacing the Impact Factor is Not the Only Point. So this is clearly a timely topic, and I encourage you to check that out at scholarlykitchen.sstnet.org. Okay, so the impact factor attempts to evaluate the relative importance of the journal based on how often its articles are cited. Generally speaking, you can take a citation as a recommendation, a sort of promotion, so that the more citations you have, the better your journal or article. This isn't always the case, but it is a generalization that impact factor is based on. The score is calculated by taking the number of citations in 1 year made to the journal articles of the previous 2 years and dividing the number of articles published in that time period, i.e. the most recent impact factor scores, the 2011 scores, are the number of citations made in 2011 to articles published in 2009 and 2010 divided by the sum of articles published in that same time period. So let's break that down real quick with a practical example. These are numbers from a real journal, Herpetologica. In 2011, its 2010 articles were cited 35 times, and its 2009 articles were cited 87 times. This gives us a total of 122 cites to recent articles. It had 46 articles published in 2010 and 30 in 2009, for a total of 76 recent articles. So what do we do with that? You divide the cites to recent items, 122, by the number of recent items, 76, which gives you an impact factor of 1.605. A base score, an impact factor of 1, means that on average, articles published in the journal 1 or 2 years ago have been cited once. So an impact factor of 1.605 means, you guessed it, articles published in the journal 1 or 2 years ago have been cited an average of 1.605 times. One nice thing about the impact factor is that Thomson Reuters breaks this all down for you. You can see something pretty similar to this slide when you check out your own scores on their website. And the 5-year impact factor is pretty similar. It's basically just the impact factor, only looking at a wider period of time. Instead of 2 years' worth of historical data, you're looking at 5, which can give you a broader view of journal citation performance over time. You take the total number of citations to 5 years' worth of articles and divide that by the number of articles published in the same period. For Herpetologica, that's 309 citations divided by 213 articles. And voila, their 5-year impact factor score is 1.451. Since this is lower than their regular impact factor score, that's a pretty good indicator that the regular impact factor has risen in the past 5 years. The 5-year impact factor takes a little longer to be affected since it is looking at a longer period of time. So the impact factor is a nice, relatively simple quantitative measurement, and all in all, it's a pretty good way of comparing journals. The calculations aren't difficult, and Thomson Reuters generally breaks it down for you. However, it's not a great way to compare measurements across different fields. Some areas of research, especially as you get into niche studies, have fewer journals, fewer scientists, fewer articles, and what does that mean? Fewer citations and a lower impact factor score. It is important to remember that people commonly associate this weakness with the impact factor, and it is one, but this is something you're going to run into with most journal metrics. We haven't invented a completely foolproof way to compare apples to oranges, physics to social studies, zoology to paleomolecular gerontology. Other non-quality related forces that can have an effect on the impact factor are the number of articles published. If you're looking to add pages to your publication, you may want to examine how much this could possibly dilute your score. Also, impact factor does include self-citations, citations made by your journal to its own articles. One of the earliest ways journals have tried to inflate their scores is by asking submitting authors to cite other articles in the journal. Thomson discourages this by sticking journals with self-citation rates in about the 20% or higher range and a sort of impact factor timeout. They withhold your score until self-citation rates are back at a lower level. Keep this in mind because other metrics discount self-citations entirely. There are a couple of other metrics put out by Thomson Reuters that are closely related to the impact factor. The immediacy index is a measure of how topical and urgent a journal's articles are, meaning the average number of times an article cited in the year it's published. Please remember that the immediacy index does not indicate the journal's impact on the field. A given journal's articles could be slow or simmering and receive a steady stream of citations over a much longer extended period of time. And again, there are large differences in scores between different fields. A medical paper is going to be, quote, important much more quickly than, say, a general biology article. The partner metric, the immediacy index, is the cited half-life. The immediacy index tells you how many times your recent articles were cited. The cited half-life tells you how long it takes your articles to get cited. The cited half-life is the median age of articles cited in the current year that's being reported by JCR. This means that half the citations to the journal are within the cited half-life and half are not. And since medical journals have a higher immediacy index, they are likely to have a lower cited half-life. Their papers are cited quickly, the research moves on, and the science quickly becomes obsolete. Fields like math, physics, etc. have a lower immediacy index as their articles may take longer to have a broad impact, but the papers are likely relevant and citable for a much longer period of time. Again, this is not a metric that measures the impact of a journal in the field. The cited half-life and the immediacy index are good measures related to the impact factor, drilling down a little deeper into citation patterns over time. The Eigenfactor score is probably more familiar to most people than some of the other metrics we'll get into in a bit, mostly because JCR reports on the scores along with the impact factor. Eigenfactor claims to measure the journal's total importance to the scientific community, but what exactly does that mean? And how is it any different from what the impact factor is trying to do? The difference between Eigenfactor and the impact factor is that Eigenfactor counts citations in higher-ranked journals more than a lower-ranked journal. For the impact factor, a citation is a citation, but if your journals are frequently cited places like Nature, Cell, the New England Journal of Medicine, that's going to bump up your Eigenfactor score more than, say, the Regional Journal of Obscurity. This also means I can't walk you through a calculation of the Eigenfactor. The sources of every citation would have to be considered, and that's a rather long and boring process to manually examine. Another difference between the Eigenfactor score and the impact factor is that Eigenfactor does not use self-citations in its calculation. As I mentioned, impact factor does count self-citation. It suspends your scores if you self-cite too much, but those do count towards your impact factor. Eigenfactor is purely citations from other journals, or other ranked journals anyway. If you're cited by a journal not rated by JCR, that does not count either. Size also impacts your score. The larger your journal, the more articles you have, the higher your score is going to be. This isn't necessarily true for the impact factor. And all Eigenfactor scores are pieces of a whole. All scores rolled together equal 100, so you can look at a journal score as a fraction. I still caution that Eigenfactor isn't a great comparison across different fields, but since the score is a piece of a grand total, you could look at it as a comparison across all fields. The time period considered also varies a bit from the impact factor. The Eigenfactor score is based on the number of times articles from that journal published in the last 5 years have been cited in JCR that year. The 5-year publication window is called the target window. Impact factor only considers articles published in the past 2 years. The census period is the period in which articles were cited, and both Eigenfactor and impact factor look at 1 year's worth of citation data. This probably makes the Eigenfactor score for a given journal less variable from year to year, but that's not necessarily guaranteed. So there are some differences between Eigenfactor and impact factor, but they're still pretty similar. Eigenfactor tends to measure the journal's impact a bit more widely by recognizing differences in the journals that are citing your articles and by throwing out the self-citations. And to access your impact factor score, you must have a subscription to Thomson Reuters JCR reporting. JCR also reports on the Eigenfactor, but you can also get your Eigenfactor score independently at eigenfactor.org. However, Eigenfactor still faces some of the challenges of the impact factor, namely the difficulties of comparing apples to oranges to studies across different fields. It's also important to note that Eigenfactor is based off of Thomson Reuters data. If you don't have an impact factor and you're not cited by someone who does, you do not have an Eigenfactor. Just like the impact factor has closely related metrics, so does Eigenfactor, the article influence score. The article influence score is calculated by dividing a journal's Eigenfactor score by the number of articles in the journal, which is normalized as a fraction of all articles in all publications, or at least those publications with Eigenfactor scores. So what this means is that the article influence score is roughly analogous to the 5-year impact factor, as they're both ratios of a given journal's citation influence in relation to the number of articles over a 5-year period of time. You can see from the graph that the numbers are directly related, granted with a few not too extreme outliers. Another metric that considers the ranking of the citing journal is the Simago Journal Rank, and fortunately for all of us, I'm not even going to attempt to discuss its formula. What that monstrosity is doing is giving a score that expresses the average number of weighted citations received in the selected year by the documents published in the journal in the previous 3 years. And what that means is that, like Eigenfactor, the value of each citation depends on the, quote, importance of the journal the citations came from. One of the main differences between Eigenfactor and the Simago Journal Rank is that Eigenfactor looks at the scores as a part of a whole. If you know your journal's Eigenfactor score, you can compare it to the breadth of research reported by Eigenfactor because you know that all scores add up to 100. Imago stand more independently in a way, since Imago scores are not a fraction of a whole. Also, Imago gets its raw data from Elsevier's Scopus database, which includes around 17,000 titles. Eigen Factor, which draws from Thomson Reuters JCR, has around 7,000 titles. This extensive coverage is obviously a strong pro quality for Imago. I also really appreciate its easy-to-use interface. And, like Eigen Factor, but unlike the impact factor, access to Imago metrics is free. However, Imago still doesn't address the main complaints levered against the Eigenfactor score and the impact factor. Namely, it can still be affected by factors that have nothing to do with the journal's quality, and it still doesn't solve the dilemma of comparing journals across different disciplines. As I mentioned, SJR has a pretty slick interface and some nice graphs that you can pull up for a given journal as well. SJR presents all sorts of information on other metrics, from the number of self-citations versus citations year over year, to representations of the journal cited versus uncited articles in 3-year spans. The graphs display the individual data points when you hover over them, which is pretty helpful as well. And while these citation metrics aren't in the vein of hard scores meant for comparison between journals, they can cast some valuable insight on the inner workings of your journal's citation trends. Another metric draws from Scopus for data, the source normalized impact per paper, or SNIP. SNIP does actually attempt to control for differences in citation behavior across research fields because it is a ratio of a source's average citation count per paper and the, quote, citation potential of its subject field. The citation potential is the average number of references per document citing that source. So if an article citing your journal has a lot of other citations, the number is more diluted than an article with only a few citation references, and the impact of a single citation given has a higher value in certain subject areas where citations are less likely, and vice versa. The main pro is the fact that SNIP does allow for comparison across fields, and like its system metric, Imago Journal Rank, SNIP is free and draws from the robust Scopus database. However, like most metrics before it, SNP scores can still be influenced by other factors. It's also still not a very good way of evaluating authors. So how can we compare authors? Fortunately, there are a few author-level metrics. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most common complaints about the impact factor and other journal-level metrics is that institutions, funding agencies, and so on are evaluating researchers based on the scores of the journals they're published in. And the impact factor, Eigen Factor, and others are meant to evaluate and compare journals. While it's great if you can get into a prestigious journal, that's not necessarily the best indicator of the value of the article or of its author. Quote, good journals do not always publish gems, and no one can claim that great articles never appear in more obscure journals. And there is so much variety and incomparability between fields. Journal-level metrics are certainly not the best indicator of who deserves tenure and funding and other decisions like that. So in order to evaluate the authors, a couple of author-level metrics have evolved. One of the most common is the H-index, also known as the Hirsch index or the Hirsch number. It's described by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences as the least evil of the metrics for individual scientists. The H-index was created to evaluate individuals, so it's defined as the largest number H, such that H publications have at least H citations. And what does that mean? An author with an H index of 20 means that they have written 20 articles that have at least 20 citations. The H index is primarily used to measure the cumulative impact and productivity of a researcher's output by looking at the amount of citations their work has received, but the H index is a rather flexible metric, because it can be applied to just about anything with articles and citations, not just authors, but journals, journal collections, groups of authors, perhaps from a certain research facility or a geographic area, subsets of articles, maybe on a certain subject or article type, etc. But our H-index of 20 for 20 articles with 20 citations is a bit too tidy for practical use. So let's take a look at a messier example. Say an author has written 5 articles with 17, 9, 6, 3, and 2 citations respectively. This means that the author has an H-index of 3. The highest H index this author could have with 5 articles is 5. But only 3 of his articles have 5 or more citations. He can't have an H index of 4 because only 3 of the articles have 4 or more citations. Thus, the papers with 3 and 2 citations are not considered. The articles that are considered, those with citations of 17, 9, and 6, are called the H score. The H median is the median of citation counts in the H score, so in this example, the author's H median is 9. The H5 index, the H5 core, and the H5 median are the H index, the H score, and the H median for only articles published in the past 5 years. If the author in our example had published the article with 17 citations 6 years ago, their H index is 2, and so forth. So one of the main benefits of the H index is how versatile it is, since it can be applied to such a wide array of article collections, be it author, journal, whatever. It also corrects for one-hit wonders. One article that receives a lot of attention in a body of work that has negligible citations, and it also corrects for prolific authors of uncited papers. You have to have both a high number of papers and a high number of citations to have a high H index score. Unlike most journal metrics, H index has no formal organization to provide an official score. The impact factor has Thomson Reuters, Eigen Factor, and article influence overseen by the University of Washington, etc. If you have access to ISI's Web of Knowledge, you can calculate your H index there. Scopus has an H index calculator, and there's also a Google Scholar gadget and a Firefox add-on. ReaderMeter has a particularly nice interface that shows a given author's H index, G index, etc., and it gets its data from Mendeley. But because the databases draw on distinct citation pools that do not completely overlap, the H indexes for a given author from these different sources seldom match. This means that any H index needs to be taken with a grain of salt because it's dependent on the number of journals included in its source. Also, the H index does not take the sum of citations into account. For example, you could have 5 articles with 5 citations each to have an H index of 5, so 25 total citations. You could also have 4 articles with 250 citations each and 1 article with 5 citations for an H index of 5 and a total of 1,005 citations. And if that last article had only 4 citations, your H index just drops. This means the H index has the potential to be highly variable. A single citation could change an author's score. The G index was created to address this limitation. It varies slightly from the H index in that it's the largest number G, such that G publications have an average of G citations. Now, this wouldn't change the metric score from the previous example if the author had only written 5 papers, but a person's G index is almost certainly higher than their H index. Also, the H index favors authors who have been in their fields longer and have a greater body of work, so a younger scientist is at a disadvantage. The M quotient was proposed to address this drawback. The M quotient is simply the H index divided by the number of years since the author's first paper was published. This somewhat addresses the disparity between junior and senior academics, but the M quotient still won't be very stable until later into someone's career. When you've only written a few papers, even a small change can have a big impact on your score. And to quote Anne Harzing at the University of Melbourne, if an academic shows good citation metrics, it's very likely that he or she has made a significant impact on the field. However, the reverse is not necessarily true. If an academic shows weak citation metrics, this may be caused by a lack of impact on the field. However, it may be also caused by working in a small field, publishing in a language other than English, or publishing mainly in books. This means that while citations specifically, metrics specifically meant for evaluating individuals are certainly better suited for the task than metrics intended for evaluating journals, no metric could possibly be an ideal indicator. Simply too many other factors are involved. One additional individual metric, the Eigen Index, which was introduced by Google in 2011, is closely related to the H index. The Eigen Index is the number of articles with at least 10 citations, so like the H index, it is primarily used to evaluate authors, but it can be applied more broadly as well. However, I had a much easier time finding the H index numbers on Google Scholar than the I-10, their own metric, So I'm not sure this has caught on yet in a big way. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the long run. Finally, I'd like to talk about an up-and-coming type of journal metric, social media metrics. These are a bit different than the other metrics we've discussed so far today because it measures social media buzz instead of citations. These are based on the number of mentions on Twitter, Facebook, Google+, blog posts, newspaper articles, etc. for a given article. The main thing to remember about social media metrics is that they are primarily useful for measuring popular articles, ones with mass appeal, rather than ones with a deep scientific impact. One of the most robust social media metrics, altmetric, gives a quantifiable score based on the number of social media mentions. An article with no mentions picked up by altmetric has a score of 0, but an article in the Journal of Parasitology that went viral back in June received an altmetric score of 312. This places it in the top 5% of all articles measured by altmetric so far this year, and it hasn't received a single citation to date. And it has a high altmetric score because it was gross. Altmetric doesn't provide the formula for their scoring system, but it does explain some of the weight of different sources. Versus volume, the more people who mention the article, the higher the score. Allegedly, only one mention per person per source counts, so multiple tweets on the same paper by the same person aren't counted. Second, consider the sources. Each category contributes a different base amount to the score. For example, a newspaper article counts more than a blog post does, and a blog post counts more than a tweet. Also, the authors of the mentions are taken into consideration. Altmetric considers a link shared by a doctor with other doctors to count more than, say, a link sent out by a publisher to promote that article. A nice benefit of altmetric is their flashy, user-friendly interface. This screenshot is from their free bookmarklet tool from the previously mentioned Journal of Parasitology article. As you can see, the analysis gives a nice breakdown of the mentions. This free tool also gives samples of the most recent tweets, mentions on Facebook, etc., and it provides some nice demographic information on where these mentions came from. I realized I must have been hovering over a country when I took this screenshot, and it took me a little while to figure out that UA is the Ukraine. So that means our parasitology article had a whopping 4 mentions in the Ukraine. Okay, so you've probably noticed the little swirly thing surrounded by the score in the upper left corner. This is a nice little way to tell at a glance where your mentions are coming from. The lighter blue is for Twitter, yellow is for blog, red is for mainstream media sources, pink is Google+, and so forth. In addition to the bookmarklet tool, which you can find on Altmetric's website, there are a few more levels of analysis. The bookmarklet, in addition to being free, can be used on any website with a DOI. All you have to do is go to an online version of the article you are trying to score, click, and voila. No special coding or anything needed. But you can get your web developers to insert some coding into your journal site by using Altmetric API or Application Programming Interface. This is free to use to an extent. You can get a deeper level of statistics with the API, but if you need bulk data or want to get past the rate limits, you have to get a commercial license. Altmetric does say that it will work with nonprofits and give them a free license, so that could be worth checking out. Licenses for for-profits have varied pricing depending on the level of service and number of users you need to have access. Besides placing a bit of code behind the scenes for your articles or using the free bookmarklet, you can also place a badge, kind of like a social media badge, on your article level pages. You can see some examples to the left. Then your readers can see the altmetric score for the article they are viewing and can reach deeper information like the previous screenshot with a click. This visibility could remind readers to make their own mentions on their social media platforms as well. Pricing for the badge feature depends primarily on the number of journals covered. Finally, for the creme de la creme of access, there's the Altmetric Explorer. This lets you run reports on more of a journal level. You can enter in the name of the journal, see how many of its articles have an altmetric rating, and then get a deeper level of reporting on your demographics. Altmetric does have a free trial offer, which I highly recommend you to check out. It could be an excellent way to evaluate your press release articles or anything else that could have a high profile to the public. So now for your pros and cons. First, and most importantly, this is the only real scoring system of social media mentions that I've come across. There are others that are up and coming, Plum Analytics and Impact Story are too, but Altmetric is the only main player right now. You're the biggest fish in the pond if you're the only fish in the pond. It also has a delightfully intuitive interface, and as I've mentioned, it does have levels of free access and offers free trials for its other options. However, for the cons, the metrics are less reliable for articles published prior to July 2011, so this is not going to be helpful if you're looking for any kind of historical data. I attempted to run the free bookmarklet on an article in the Journal of Mammalogy that talks about the types of vehicles that are more likely to be broken into by bears in Yosemite. It was quite popular in 2009, but Altmetric didn't turn out much of anything at all. Also, scores are only available on the article level, so this isn't really the best way to compare journals. One other thing I wanted to add is that mentions on Twitter, Facebook, blogs, etc. only count if they reference a link to or link to a version of the article that contains the DOI. That parasitology article I mentioned earlier was picked up in all sorts of places, the Huffington Post, ABC's news blog, and several others, but those mentions were not counted. Those sources said something like an article appearing in the Journal of Parasitology and didn't link to its online version. This is a pro in that it's actually a hard definition, a distinction between something that actually mentions the article versus a general discussion of the research. But it is a little disappointing that you don't always get credit, especially for some of those big name media comments. And finally, as I said, Altmetrics measures the popularity of the article. It has nothing to do with the number of citations or perceived scientific impact. I did want to show you a quick screenshot from Impact Story. It's pretty similar to Altmetrics, but not quite as robust. You can see the same kind of stuff like the number of Facebook likes, tweets, citations, etc., but not blogs, major media outlets, and things like that. And you also don't get any examples of these tweets and things. Impact Story does include Wikipedia and the number of times the article was bookmarked, which I found interesting. Another difference between Impact Story and Altmetric is that Altmetric is primarily searchable by journals, but Impact Story focuses its searches by authors. So not only is Impact Story a decent companion to Altmetric, it could be useful for looking at authors and individuals. I'd like to close with a comic compiled higher and deeper titled Your Real Impact Factor. It's a humorous reminder that all metrics have their own strengths and weaknesses. Some citations to a paper could be negative and debunk a given work. Some could be self-citations or requested citations, whether through a deliberate attempt to manipulate the system or not. Professor Hank Melled, creator of the SNIP metric, said, all indicators are weighted differently and thus produce different results. This is why I believe that we can never have just one ranking system. We must have as wide a choice of indicators as possible. No single metric can do justice to all fields and deliver one perfect ranking system. I hope that this webinar has demystified some of these alternative metrics out there and will help guide your choices as you look to evaluate different journals, articles, and authors.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. We did have quite a few questions chatted in, so we will go through those now. The first question is about impact factor. One of our participants wanted to know if they are not already being indexed by Thomson Reuters and have an impact factor, what do they need to do in order to get that process started, and how long does it take before they get their first impact factor?
I know that it takes quite a long time. I'm not exactly sure how long it takes, and there is quite a process. I recommend looking at Thomson Reuters' website. I'm sure they have a lot of good guides, but there's a lot that they're looking for, and you'll have to make sure you meet all of their criteria before you bother wait and see if you get an impact factor.
Absolutely, and that impact factor score includes the first 2 years, so you're going to have to wait at least 2 years to get enough articles out to be given a score, right? We had another question about the Eigen Factor, and just a little bit of confusion. Is it a high number or a low number a better score for Eigen Factor?
I believe a higher number is a better score for the Eigenfactor. I mean, it looks a little different from your impact factor score, and like I said, the more articles you have, the higher it's going to be. So just because you have a lower number, that's not necessarily a value indicator, but a higher score is preferable.
Okay, so another question, again, sort of related to, whether folks who aren't necessarily being given an impact factor right now. If your journal is more obscure, do you have any suggestions for things that can be done or resources to boost citations or visibility so that you do get more citations?
If it is more of an obscure journal, I mean, things to do to boost your citations, that's generally an indicator of the quality of the article. So you want to make sure that, you're getting good articles in there. Those are the things that impact your metrics. Your metrics don't impact your citations, but it might be a good idea to focus on some of the more social media scores so you can get the attention out there and see if you can, get some more articles, some more submissions in, and use your social media tools and free tools that way.
Right. Anything that's going to sort of promote your articles out to the general public, sometimes it's going to lead to a citation and sometimes not. So things like even just doing press releases on your content are going to get people reading, and then if they find the articles to be of value, then they might actually be citing it as well. Do you know if Altmetric also includes mentions on LinkedIn?
I do not believe it includes mentions on LinkedIn, but I know Altmetric is still growing, and they're still making a lot of changes to their site. They're looking to expand, so I know they were very responsive when I contacted them with some of my questions, so that might be a good recommendation to make.
And then somebody else chatted in to kind of help out with the previous question about impact factor. One way to impact your impact factor is to include review type articles in your publication. So thanks for that. We also had somebody ask about the costs, and I know you covered these some along the way. Are there costs associated with some of these metrics, either in receiving the metric or just being able to find it? I know
a number of them are free. Eigenfactor is free. You can find it on their website if you don't have access to find that on JCR. JCR is not free. You do have to have a subscription to see all of those ratings. And like I said, Altmetric has a lot of different levels of availability. Their free bookmarklet tool is really fun to play around with, and they do have a couple of different levels. And they do have free trials for their paid versions, so that could be interesting to take a look at as well.
So another question, ISI is now including some peer-reviewed books in their metrics. Do you know where these show up in citation indices?
Unfortunately, I don't know. I work primarily with academic journals, and my focus in this presentation was on, journal and author level metrics, but that would be something to look into.
Okay, so another question about Eigenfactor. I noticed that many good journals have Eigenfactor and AI values that are close to 100. Journals that are considered more prestigious or have much greater impact factors don't seem to have much greater Eigenfactor values than do more successfully journals in the same field. Does the Eigenfactor provide a useful way in determining quality among journals in the field? I mean, because, we've talked about the fact that your impact factor doesn't necessarily indicate that the articles are of high quality or that it was a good citation. So do you think Eigenfactor kind of helps get around that?
I don't think Eigenfactor really normalizes for differences between fields. It's got the same kind of weakness as the impact factor does. SNIP is the one that attempts to address that, but really the main difference between impact factor and Eigenfactor is that Eigenfactor is ranking where your citations are coming from. So if you have a journal with maybe a lower Eigenfactor than you'd hope, that's really kind of difficult to control because that's just based on where your citations are coming from.
So I know, you've mentioned that sort of no metric is sort of the complete package in terms of the information that you want, to determine about the quality of your article. So do you have a suggestion for maybe a combination of metrics that folks might focus on to sort of get a more complete picture of impact?
I mean, the only thing I should say to that is really the more metrics you look at, the fuller a picture you're going to have. So if you're only focusing on the impact factor, that's only going to tell you about impact factors. The more you look at, the more you're going to know. So I would encourage pretty much everyone to take a look at as a robust field of metrics as they can to get a good picture of their journal.
So another question about Eigenfactor. Can you tell us which numbers to pay attention to? Is it the percentile value shown by the bar graph, or is it the EF and AI value shown to the right? I don't know back on that slide. We may have to take a look at that slide again, and I'll just write down the name of the participant who chatted that in, and we'll get you some more information and maybe let you talk with Lindsay about some of this stuff. So it looks like that is all the questions that we have for today. I do want to thank Lindsay and all of our participants in today's webinar. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and that you have a better understanding of the variety of methods that there are out there for calculating impact. We will be sending out a brief survey that will include links to both the slides and a video recording of today's session. So please do take a few moments to complete the survey. We're always looking for feedback on how we can improve future webinars and suggestions for future topics. This is our last webinar of the season, so we would especially appreciate your comments on topics that you might like to see covered next year as we'll be putting together our program for next year in the coming months. And don't forget, you can continue the conversation on Facebook as well. That concludes our session for today. Thank you very much for coming.